GIS, acronym number 2. So what does SAR GIS mean, at least to me? And I look at SAR GIS as the use and creation of geospatial tools, whatever they may be, whether it's a paper map, a GPS, a web map, an app, a whiteboard. It's using these tools for the mission of SAR. And often, to make it really simple, we use the mission so that others may live, which is pretty vague. So if you're not familiar with SAR, or maybe you are familiar with SAR but you're not familiar with GIS, one of the key things is that in my experience of doing GIS for, I guess, 10 years now, search and rescue is the most inherently spatial problem I've ever dealt with. Is that a safe assumption? When we look at search and rescue, if you're not familiar with acronym number 3, LAST, locate, access, stabilize, transport, are there any in there that don't include an X and Y? Probably not. We have in the past, as a team here, the SAR GIS team, we tend to really focus on the locate part, because that's for obvious reasons. If we can't find the person, we can't do any of the others. But we often overlook that last one, which I've added to the acronym, which is prevention. So we won't go too deep into preventative search and rescue today, but we will address it. I really think of this as a very, very spatially rich problem that we often don't use a lot of spatial tools to solve. So that's where GIS can come in. So for those of you that aren't familiar with GIS, or maybe you're familiar with a different definition, I think of it as just data that you can see on a map and analyze. There are lots of other really complex definitions, but that's always been the simplest one for me. And the powerful thing about GIS and the tools we produce from it is during an incident, and if you're a incident commander or planning section chief, you'll be really familiar with, as soon as an incident occurs, everybody wants to know everything. There's a huge demand for information, and we're working with very little of it. Putting it on a map begins to close that gap between supply and demand, which is really important. And more what I'm finding is it actually works the other way too. After a while, we have too much information and we can't make decisions. I think maps can help focus, if it's a good map, so that we have the right amount of information to make decisions. That's a crude diagram I drew in PowerPoint. But actually, that comes out of a book by Gisley, I can't remember his last name, about leadership in crisis. He throws up a much nicer looking diagram than that. But I think maps really help with that particular problem. Geospatial or GIS is used in a lot of industries. Matter of fact, I can't think of industries that it's not involved in. Even the coffee you're drinking, Starbucks, which is part of the axis of evil, uses GIS to figure out things like when to roll out the pumpkin spice latte, right? So I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but realize that GIS is used all over in industries where spatial is involved. So that would be most of them. So you're not alone in search and rescue if you're thinking about using geospatial tools. So we should actually learn from these other industries. And that's a lot about what we're here to do today. So for those of you that do GIS, maybe a few people can give me an example. What do you do with GIS in your day-to-day work outside of SAR? I'll pick. What's that?
Map books.
Map books. Yep.
They do parcel updates for our county.
Yes. Perfect example. There are thousands of GIS people updating parcels on a day-to-day basis. And while they might like using the tools, I'm guessing you're here because you'd also like to see GIS used for things other than updating parcels, right? So what I'm trying to get at is GIS is a really, really large community. If you go to the Esri user conference, there's 13,000 more, 16,000 people there, all using geospatial tools on a day-to-day basis for all sorts of problems. So what I've always dreamt of is having search and rescue a part of that community. So that's, these events are a really big part of that. We're not going to cover search management or search and rescue 101 in great detail, but just the 3 key problems that I look at, the search part, the rescue part, and prevention part, are all geospatial. In my research and our work, we tend to focus on the search part. Like I said before, if you can't find them, you can't do the other bits. There's 2 really key components of a search operation is, are we looking in the right place? So you'll hear us throw around the term probability of area, POA, which is a rough definition of it. And if we search there, do we do well? Probability of detection. So I'm only going into this because I think it's a really key part of what you're going to learn about this week is if we don't look in the right place, even if we search really well, we don't find the person. So if Jeff is missing and he's in the bathroom and we don't search in the bathroom, we don't find him, no matter how well we search everywhere else. So I tend to prioritize POA. POD, how well we search, is also really important, but I think we tend to overlook that POA part. So that's a large reason why I got involved in search and rescue, was because I was in Yosemite National Park as a ranger, a GIS ranger, being asked to help out with a search. And I saw lots of challenges around POA that could be solved by stepping outside our day-to-day of just using a USGS topo map. So that's why I personally got involved. Over time, I saw lots of benefits for rescue, for pre-planning. So even if we know where the person is, how are we going to get there safely? Are there any known hazards? So pre-planning is a big part of the rescue part. But GIS is also real time. So GIS also can help us monitor status of people in the field. We'll do a little bit of that on Wednesday. And then probably the most commonly overlooked part is that prevention piece. So prevention in the national parks is a core mission, as far as I know. We spend a lot of time and effort in the parks putting people out at trailheads to try to give the right information to prevent the preventable incidents. So don't worry, for those of you that love SAR, we're never going to get rid of search and rescue, but there are certainly lots of preventable injuries and illnesses, and GIS plays a really big part of that. And that actually ended up taking over most of my interest for my PhD research. I focused actually a lot on prevention. Who can give me an example of a preventable injury? What's that? Right, so having water and food. Is that a spatial problem? Yeah, absolutely. We need to make sure people know what they need out on the trails before they go. And that might be at the trailhead, or probably even better, where? At home, at home. And maps can play a really critical part in that storytelling. So this is the most boring part of the whole entire training, but I really want to get us to that point where we have those three pieces of language: the search, the rescue, and the prevention. Especially for those of us that do GIS, this may be some new material for you. On this story map, which I'll make available over the years, Don Ferguson, who you'll meet later, and others have contributed some examples of what I was just talking about. So if we were going to look at searching in the right place, one of the most common challenges is, did they have a cell phone? If they had a cell phone, regardless of where they are, that is a useful piece of information. Even if you're not in cell coverage where you are or where you think they are, we need to rule that out. And so cell phone analysis is a great way to work on that POA problem, that probability of area problem. So Don here looks like he did an analysis on a particular tower. It's kind of a quick and dirty with this pie sector. Have people seen that before? Those of you that work in law enforcement? And then Don's taking into account the terrain to just say, all right, well, if they were able to get a cell phone signal out, this is where they're more likely to be. It's not the only piece of information we use, but it's one that we keep in our tool belt. And that's where geospatial has a real value. You can't really do this without a map. I'd like to see you do it on a whiteboard, but I think a map is the way to go. So I want to talk a little bit about the who, because I've only met a handful of you that are sitting here. So we've got some new people to the community. You came here, so you're now part of the community. You don't have a choice. But we started out as really a group of national park rangers, some sheriffs in California, mountain rescue volunteers, and elders that were all trying to do pretty much the same thing at the same time, right around 2007, 2008. And some of those are here in the room with us today. You'll see Don and Vanessa. Others couldn't make it, but George is kind of the patron saint of this movement, because George is a wilderness ranger who spent, I don't know how many years in the backcountry, 42. And he saw lots of issues with how we were using maps in the Park Service. So he took it upon himself not to learn the stuff we're using today or tomorrow, which I say is, relatively easy. He was learning the hardcore desktop GIS tools just so that he could make a nice map. I'm happy to say it's gotten a lot easier since George started. But when I saw George get involved, I knew we were really onto something, because here's someone who's taking time out and above their service to the parks to figure this out. And we've grown a lot. Because we've grown, we've formed a core team. So under that National Alliance for Public Safety GIS, NAPSG, we've formed a working group so that we can take all the work we've been doing over the past 9 years and start to consolidate it, organize it, and disseminate it. So this event is really sort of sponsored and run by the core team, and you'll meet a lot of them here today. But our charter, or our goal, was to create an international network, not just US, of basically SAR-based GIS tools, geospatial tools, that would help with that core mission. So if you look at the community now, we started a Google group, like a forum for email discussion a long time ago. How many people here are a member of that group? Great. For a long time, that's been our primary way to disseminate information. So we'll definitely make sure you get signed up before you leave. But I just wanted to take a look at the community that's grown. Obviously, we're a bit deep in the US, but we actually have people from agencies around the world. And since I've moved to New Zealand, we're seeing the numbers grow in this area. And that's really, really important, because even though in the United States we have lots of resources, we often overlook some of the simplicity and simple things we can do. And so I think it's really important to bring in other stakeholders. And that's really exciting to me that we have people from pretty much every continent except for Antarctica. Our past, the reason we've been able to do this is because we've been able to host free events through the help of NAPSG Foundation now, but in the past, just kind of through the hospitality of the Park Service and others to host us. But this has always been a free event. We plan to always keep it as a free event. And we've been able to get around the country quite a bit to do these workshops and dedicated trainings. And the next time that we will probably see each other, for a lot of us, will be at the Esri User Conference, where we usually have a special interest group meeting. I don't know if that's been scheduled yet, but that would be the next time to meet. We started our first year in Joshua Tree. Who was here for the first one? I think just George would have been the only one. So that was a group from Sierra Madre, Joshua Tree, and a couple of the local SoCal teams. And we got together and whiteboarded what we thought were the priorities for SAR and GIS. And it'd be hard for you to read, but we basically wanted maps for incident action plans, briefings, transportation, progression, and some spatial analyses. But the goal was always to get people out the door quickly with paper maps so they can get out and do their jobs. And then when they come back, to use the intel gathered to better understand where to go next. And that's still some of our primary goals around that search piece. From there, we moved on to Yosemite. I don't know if the SAR cache is still there. This is a much nicer facility than the old SAR cache, but the backdrop was better. We've met in Grand Canyon, Dunsmuir, California, Sonora, California. Last year we were in DC at the USGS headquarters. So we've been able to get around the country and talk about this mission. I'm really happy that you've all joined us. I've always wanted to come back to the Rockies because I feel like this is a real hotbed of mountain rescue activity. How many people are here from MRA teams, Mountain Rescue Association teams? Yep. So a lot of the tools we're going to show you already have access to. They're kind of sitting there waiting. So it's a good opportunity to bring you into the mix because we've had a lot of MRA participation before. We also do some incident support, but I don't think of us as an incident management team, but mostly we've helped through guidance. So if someone's doing SAR GIS on an incident and they have a question, they hit a roadblock, they can come to our group and ask a question. But in some states, we've worked with the GIS Corps to be part of the mutual aid system, because we recognize not every SAR team has someone with geospatial skills. So that's something we're looking to do more and more. So if you're here from a state coordinating role, that'd be an interesting topic to break out and discuss later this afternoon. But I think our most valuable contribution as a community is best practices. And what we've done is not started from scratch. We got together and put together a free PDF that you can download. While the technology used was a little bit older, it has really core essential lessons for you to take away. And a lot of those were taken from wildland fire, emergency management, or other uses of GIS and incorporated into SAR. And then finally, one of the things we contribute is software. Now, we're here today in the Esri building. A lot of the tools we'll use are based off of ArcGIS, what Don and John co-evolved with, John Petter, who helped build the first version of MapSAR, they started using something called ArcMap, which is a traditional GIS tool, and they made it work for search and rescue workflows. We won't spend that much time on this today because I want to move on to some of the tools that are easier to get into. But you will see some of this on day 3 and the end of day 2. And there's a cheesy movie there that I won't play for you now. MapSAR the movie. But this was Don and John on both coasts of the country developing almost the same tool. They've worked off the same general data model, and Don's really focused on the planning and analysis components, which has been really powerful. In Canada, in the maritime provinces, there's another tool called SAR Explorer, which I haven't seen used much in the US, but it's a free app, really, really basic, and will look a lot like MapSAR Online, which is a tool we're going to be using tomorrow. So our goal was really to bring these together, to stop doing parallel efforts and actually just work together as a community. All of the software we develop we consider open source and can receive contribution from anyone. So it's not a black box that only John and Don can contribute to. We've also carried out a fair amount of research. I was able to convince the University of California that search and rescue is an environmental system problem. So I received my PhD in environmental systems, but my core topic was search and rescue, which was really cool. And I got to work with Don and Jared on it. And I won't talk too much about that, but I just released the beta version of my open data site. So if you want to see some of the Yosemite data, you can get into that and see a little bit more on what I consider preventative search and rescue tools. Because the first step to understanding prevention is to know what's happened in the past. So I took 10 years of SAR reports and plotted them on a map and began to analyze things like the spatial distribution of different types of incidents. Caroline Rose is here. She's also done her master's on search and rescue as a topic. And she looked at a lot of the challenges that SAR practitioners face with mapping technology. What are some of the key barriers to entry? And what some of the solutions are. Jared is here, and he focused specifically on the missing person problem in Yosemite. And he was one of the first people to identify the use of watershed boundaries as a container for our search, for just a rough idea of this might be a good planning unit to use in a mountainous area. And we'll talk a lot about open data, but that watershed boundary layer is open data. It's available for everywhere in the United States, and I'm told Canada. So what's the challenge? We've got smart people working on this. I think everybody in here can agree that it's worth doing. It's worth looking at geospatial. But why doesn't everyone use geospatial tools the same way? And Caroline can probably answer this better than me. But we did a survey about 2 years ago, and we found that not even half the teams really use anything with any analysis capability. They're just printing paper maps, and they're just generally using USGS topo maps. So we can talk all day about some of the reasons, but one of the reasons is it was hard. It was hard to use a desktop GIS software. This is just an example from a training we did in San Bernardino, but trying to explain this to people who don't look at GIS day to day just didn't work. No matter what we tried to do, it wasn't usable for SAR teams. I can say that a lot of barriers have been knocked down since then. It's gotten easier to use. You'll see that with the tools we use. Price, the Esri nonprofit organization program, has become really, really valuable for SAR teams. The Mountain Rescue Association already has access to these tools. The Park Service has access to these tools. So I think that last remaining bit is lowering the barrier of entry into using it. So that brings us to the future. So today is the future. We're working right now to build out this community. I think that's number one, is that we all get to know each other. I think that web GIS is going to be a key component, whether you're working on or offline. Web, in this case, doesn't mean internet. It means we're connected. It means you can see what I'm seeing on my screen, and you can contribute. So don't think of web GIS as a dirty word if you always work in a disconnected environment. And you'll see that in in our examples tomorrow. And then open data. Something we really, really overlook is how much great information is available to you that you're going to go home with, regardless of whatever mapping system you're using. You'll be able to use the data sets and you'll understand where they fit into a SAR workflow. So I think open data is a core theme for this year's SAR discussion. We're already seeing examples of this. The MRA is out in front collecting geospatial data for their missions, not just paper forms or an Excel spreadsheet. They're actually collecting the where and when of their incidents. MapStar Online is a tool that you'll get to interact with pretty heavily over the next 3 days. And I think that's really going to lower the barrier of entry because it's going to be a tool that's built for and easy to use. And the reality is you can get started. So you'll learn a lot over the next 3 days. One of the key parts is to join the discussion. So we'll get you logged into our discussion group if you're interested. We do keep a regular blog where we push out new best practices. So rather than just email all the time, we try to have one central repository for some best practices. And free training. So the training that you have over the next 3 days, you'll be able to take that home with you. So if you didn't finish something or you want to dig in deeper, that's all freely available and be made freely available for you. So you've got 3 ways to take this home with you. You can share this story map. I'll make sure it gets out to all of you. You can share it with your teams. I hope that it helps. And how many people realize this was a story map? Cool. I'm not a developer. I can't build websites. I configured this using the same tools you're going to use to deploy a MapSAR. And I think we need to do more of this type of explanation. I think a lot of times we dive into the technology, but we forget about why we're here. So that's all I have to kick us off. I hope it wasn't too dry. Was this interesting? For those of you that aren't, of course you're going to say yes. If you, anybody here not ever worked with our mission? I want you to feel really comfortable saying yes. Okay. And anybody here not know how to spell GIS? Or just has never, they've used mapping tools, but they've never used something that they feel comfortable calling a GIS. Okay, that's fine. We're here to help each other out. I would argue everybody's done GIS in one way or another. Even if you've worked paper maps and Mylar overlays or whiteboards, that's a form of GIS, and you're going to have a lot easier time picking it up because you understand the power of it and what maps offer you. So don't worry about that. So I'm going to introduce our moderator for the day, Vanessa, who's now working in Glen Canyon. I almost say Grand Canyon. You're not there anymore. And Vanessa is going to help keep us on track today. And she's going to introduce the speakers. She's really serious about the time card. So we'll do the best we can to stay on track, just to be respectful to all the presenters and make sure that we can keep the tempo going. If you need to take a break while the next presenter comes up, the bathrooms, as Jared said, are out and to the right. And if you want to just stand up and stretch your legs, a lot of you drove here, I think that's a great idea while we introduce the next presenter. Yeah. So quick break, and then we'll introduce the next presenter. Good.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, we don't know if it's recording.
It is, but